In medieval Europe, women's lives were dictated not by personal choice, but by the agreements of families. Marriage wasn't an act of love. It was a political and economic transaction. Daughters, especially from noble families, were viewed as bargaining chip stools to seal alliances, secure land, and ensure family interests. These young girls were often promised to men they had never met, long before they could even understand the significance of such a commitment. By the time girls reached the age of 12, they were legally considered of marriageable age according to church law. In some cases, they were betrothed as early as 7. Marriage, during the medieval period, was not a personal affair. It was a matter of property, law, and social positioning. Jurists like Guillaume Durand, in 1270, bluntly noted that marriage was more about property than love. The goal wasn't happiness or emotional connection, but ensuring political alliances and economic stability for families, for daughters of the nobility. These arrangements were made with little regard for their desires or feelings. The medieval world viewed women as assets to be traded, used to expand territories, form alliances, and secure peace. Consent, though required by law, was often a mere formality. The concept of consent in marriage was one of legality, not autonomy. A young girl, surrounded by her male relatives and religious figures, was expected to obey. Her wishes or fears were considered secondary. In fact, many medieval women were coerced into marriages they had no say in. Historical records from medieval courts reveal instances of women later claiming that they had never consented to their marriage or were forced into it by family pressure or coercion. Some were even taken by force, others under threat, and many simply had no voice in these decisions. Once a woman entered into marriage, her independence was almost entirely erased. The legal term femme covert referred to a woman's loss of legal identity once she married. Her status was absorbed into her husband's, meaning she could no longer own property, enter into contracts, or even leave her household without his permission. In medieval England, even the Magna Carta, a monumental legal document, offered no rights for women. Their lives, their bodies, and their legal standing were firmly controlled by men. The Church, while providing the religious framework for marriage, reinforced the notion of male dominance. Canon law held that the man was the ruler of the household, and women's roles were to serve him. A woman's role in marriage was to bear children, produce heirs, and maintain the household, all while maintaining strict obedience to her husband. It was a life of subjugation, defined by the needs and desires of the men who controlled her fate. Women's lives in medieval Europe were often defined by their roles as wives and mothers. Marriage meant childbearing, and a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce children, particularly male heirs. This relentless focus on reproduction brought with it grave risks. Childbirth was fraught with dangers. There was no modern medicine, no anesthesia, no trained obstetricians. Women gave birth at home, often with the help of midwives who, while experienced, lacked the formal medical knowledge necessary to prevent or treat complications. The risks for women, even those of noble birth, were incredibly high. Peasant women, whose lives were marked by hard labor, malnutrition, and poor health, faced even greater dangers. For these women, the physical toll of constant work, combined with limited resources, made childbirth an even more perilous endeavor. Studies show that between 1 in 10 and 1 in 12 women in medieval Europe died in childbirth. Complications like hemorrhage, obstructed labor, and puerperal fever claimed countless lives. In the absence of surgical intervention, if a woman's labor was obstructed or her health was failing, the only recourse was to allow the child to die or risk the mother's life. Caesarean sections were a rarity, and they were only performed posthumously after the mother had died. For noble women, the pressure to bear children was unrelenting. They were expected to produce heirs to secure their family's political and social standing. Anne Neville, Queen of England and wife of Richard III, likely died in 1485 from childbirth. Complications, an all-too-common fate for noble women. Even those who survived childbirth often endured multiple pregnancies, sometimes up to 10 or more, depending on the family's need for male heirs. The dangers of childbirth were not just physical, but also spiritual. According to the teachings of the Church, A woman who died in childbirth without confessing her sins was thought to be in danger of eternal damnation. Priests were sometimes called to administer last rites to women in labor, reinforcing the grim reality that childbirth was not a joyful event, but a dangerous gamble. Despite the grave risks, women were expected to continue bearing children. This expectation was deeply rooted in the societal structure of the time, which viewed women primarily as vessels for reproduction. Their worth was often tied to their ability to produce children, particularly sons. Childbearing was a woman's duty, and failure to do so was seen as a failure of her role as a wife. In this medieval society, women were expected to live in obedience and silence. Marriage, while often forced upon them, was the only option available. They were bound to the whims of men and subjected to societal expectations. That stifled their autonomy. Yet despite all the hardships they faced, women continued to bear the weight of their roles, their lives dictated by the men who controlled them in medieval Europe. Childbirth was one of the most perilous experiences for women. It was often not a moment of celebration, but a grim gamble with life. Women had no access to modern medicine, to anesthesia, or trained doctors, and the result was a brutal and unpredictable process. Most women gave birth at home, assisted by midwives women who had practical experience but lacked formal medical training. Even among the nobility, where wealth could afford the best resources, childbirth was still fraught with unimaginable risks. For peasants, the risks of childbirth were even greater. Constant physical labor, poor nutrition, and lack of proper health care meant that childbirth was almost always life-threatening. The dangers were magnified for peasant women who spent most of their lives working the fields or performing strenuous tasks. Their bodies were often weakened by malnutrition, constant labor, and inadequate care, which made them even more vulnerable when it came time to give birth. Childbirth mortality rates were devastating. By some estimates, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 12 births ended in the death of the mother. Complications like obstructed labor, hemorrhage, puerperal, fever, and infections claimed countless lives. The absence of surgical knowledge or anesthetic means that women endured their labor in agony. Caesarean sections, if performed at all, were done posthumously, meaning they were only attempted after the mother had already passed away or was deemed beyond hope. In the absence of modern hygiene practices, even the wealthiest women faced serious risks. Poor sanitation and lack of sterilization meant that many childbirths occurred in unsanitary conditions. Midwives reused instruments, and noble women sometimes gave birth in rooms strewn with straw that carried disease. The concept of germ theory had not yet been discovered, and as a result, infections were rampant. The lack of sanitation made an already dangerous event even more life-threatening. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and medical writer, provided a chilling description of childbirth. When the child is born, the woman's life stands on the edge of a knife. If her strength fails, she is taken. Tragically, many women did not survive childbirth, and the dangers of becoming a mother were well understood by all. Some historians even speculate that women in the medieval period viewed childbirth as a potentially fatal event, not to be undertaken lightly. The high mortality rate also meant that women often faced multiple pregnancies in their lives. It was common for noble women, for example, to endure 10 or more pregnancies, each one posing a risk to their lives. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense, and the health of the mother was often secondary to the needs of the family and its legacy. Women who survived childbirth were often expected to bear more children, regardless of their health, which added to the physical toll on their bodies. Beyond the physical dangers of childbirth, there were also spiritual concerns. The Church's teachings held that if a woman died in childbirth without having confessed her sins, her soul would be at risk. This idea added a layer of fear and anxiety to an already dangerous experience. Priests were often summoned to administer last rites to women in labor, and the idea of dying without the chance to confess one's sins created an added layer of psychological torment for mothers-2-B. Despite these risks, women in medieval Europe had little choice in the matter. The expectation to bear children was tied to their role in society, and failure to do so could bring shame or even condemnation. A woman's worth was often tied to her ability to reproduce. The birth of a male heir was seen as a family's greatest achievement, and the pressure to produce heirs was constant for those who survived childbirth. The experience marked a deepening of their role in society. As mothers, their identities became centered around the children they bore. However, the dangers of childbirth and the toll it took on their bodies left many women weakened and vulnerable to further health complications. The Church, despite its spiritual influence, did little to ease the suffering of women. It reinforced the idea that childbirth was a woman's divine duty, placing little value on her well-being outside of her reproductive function. In this rigid patriarchal society, women had little autonomy. Their fates were tied to their families, husbands, and the needs of society. Once a woman was married, her life was no longer her own. She was expected to fulfill the role assigned to her, regardless of the personal cost, whether it was through forced marriages, dangerous childbirths, or the lack of legal and social rights. Medieval women were trapped in a system that valued them for their ability to serve men, produce children, and uphold the social order. The medieval justice system, much like the world it served, was unforgiving and cruel, especially for women. Justice was not about rehabilitation, but about maintaining control over a society that sought to suppress and dominate. For women accused of crimes, particularly moral crimes, the punishment was often swift, brutal, and merciless. Adultery was one of the most severe offenses for a woman, and the punishment for it was often public humiliation. In 13th century England, women convicted of adultery were paraded through the streets wearing nothing but their smocks, heads shaved, and jeered by crowds. This public shaming was meant to serve as a warning to others and to reinforce the rigid boundaries of moral behavior in society. But the punishment was not always so mild. For theft, mutilation was a common punishment. Ears were cut off, faces branded, or fingers removed. For women, the punishment was often worse because of the added element of shame. The Church also had its own system of justice, often punishing women for offenses like fornication, blasphemy, or heresy. A woman who spoke out against authority, whether religious or secular, was seen as a threat to the patriarchal order. Women accused of heresy were subjected to trial in ecclesiastical courts, where they were often tortured until they confessed. Torture was not just a means of extracting confessions, but a method of silencing dissent. One of the most harrowing examples of medieval justice was the persecution of women during the witch hunts. Women, particularly older, poor, or isolated women, were easy targets for accusations of witchcraft. The Church's teachings reinforced the idea that women were more prone to temptation and spiritual weakness. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, laid the groundwork for widespread witch hunts, arguing that witchcraft was primarily a female crime. Women were accused of using magic to harm others. Many were tortured to extract confessions. The punishment was often execution, usually by burning, as it was believed to purify the soul. The witch hunts of medieval Europe were a direct result of the fear and misogyny that permeated the culture. The vast majority of those accused of witchcraft were women between 75% and 85%. These women were not criminals, were victims of a system that scapegoated them for society's fears and misfortunes. The witch hunts were not just acts of persecution, they were acts of social panic, institutionalized by the Church and the ruling powers. In the dark history of medieval Europe, women were often seen as property traded in marriage, abused by the justice system, and scapegoated during times of crisis. The Church, the state, and society as a whole reinforced the notion that women were inferior, subject to male authority, and their lives should be controlled for the greater good of the patriarchal system. Women were silenced, marginalized, and often punished for crimes they didn't commit, simply for being women. The medieval world in many ways was built on this systemic subjugation. It's a history that cannot be forgotten, as it shapes our understanding of gender and power in the modern world.